I think it's important for leaders to realize that they have to have the command and control structures in place before a conflict arises, and not just in place, but actually exercised, trained, practiced in their deployment missions. They have to understand how they're going to function, and especially if they're coming from off the peninsula, they have to understand how they're going to plug into existing structures in order to make the most effective use of their capabilities. I think Walker was very frustrated with the hand he'd been dealt. It was bad enough that for economy reasons they'd eliminated his 2 corps headquarters, and so he had to act both as the theater commander as well as his own corps commander with 3 U.S. divisions and then a multitude of ROC divisions who were reporting to him. So he had to do all of that, all those traditional commander activities at the tactical level, as well as conduct an operational campaign, all the while being overseen unhelpfully by General Ullman from Tokyo. You know, the Army the Army's as busy as it's ever been. General Scales wrote an article a number of years ago about the Army being too busy to learn, and I think that still holds true today. We're spread across the globe in ranks that are as thin as we've seen them in our careers, in our lifetime, certainly. I think for leaders who are about to assume command at that echelon, they should not look to history to provide the right answers, but a careful study of good history will often lead you down the path to ask the right questions. The first stage of the joint planning process requires that you gain a current understanding of the operational environment. And you cannot understand what the current situation is unless you understand how it got there. And a study of military history is an excellent way to get there. There are a number of people who have written books on the Korean War. A good starting place would be the U.S. Army's official histories, which are in-depth studies at the strategic, operational, and tactical levels. A number of academics have written books as well, and popular authors too. Clay Blair wrote a pretty impressive volume that is really the standard for the first phase of the war. Alan Millett is in the middle of writing his series of books on the Korean War. And also the Chief of Staff of the Army's professional reading list has several books that would suggest themselves. Well, aside from the Army's official or regular exercise program at the division level and above, I think any well-constructed reading program, a professional self-development program, would give commanders the insights they need to lead at that level. Anything that looks at Army operations in the First World War, the Second World War, from any belligerent's perspective, would be a valuable addition to someone's professional development. I think the greater problem is, how did the personalities prevent smooth interaction? And it was a combination of personalities. You had MacArthur, who was cold and distant, distrustful of anybody that he did not know from many years of service. Ned Almond is the exception, however, because he was a general officer in the European theater who came to the Far East basically to rehabilitate his reputation. And he insinuated himself into MacArthur's staff, made himself the indispensable man in terms of MacArthur being able to not have to interact with his other officers. Walker was also a European theater veteran, but MacArthur and Almond both viewed him as a threat. They thought that he'd been sent as a spy by General Collins, the Chief of Staff, to find out what's really going on out in the Far East. Many of the other general officers who eventually show up in Korea have extensive experience in the European theater, and I think that helps the follow-on efforts. But in the initial weeks and months of the Korean action, there's a great disconnect because the personalities are so abrasive, and there's very little love lost between any of them. I don't know that the war was that much different. The most similar theater in World War II to Korea was actually Italy, and many veterans made that. Many of the recalled reservists who served in Italy in World War II and in Korea made that comparison.
As sort of a secondary theater, light
Well,
logistics?
not just that, but also the terrain. Fighting their way up the mountains of Italy was just like fighting their way up the mountains in Korea. But in terms of the widespread relief of commanders, many of the commanders relieved in the first weeks of the war had actually been placed in command as a reward for service. They had been commanders of non-combatant units or stateside training installations, or had other senior staff positions during World War II, and it was kind of a tombstone assignment. The Army was just beginning at that point to play with officer management and looking at well-rounded careers, and so people who had qualified as leaders in one area were given command of a combat unit to further their education, basically. And so it's not surprising that many of them, having no experience to draw upon, failed in the initial test and were replaced almost immediately. 11 of the 12 regimental commanders in 8th Army are replaced by the end of August. It has the potential to, but the Army is already taking steps to mitigate that. The rewrite of FM30 to focus on large-scale combat operations is a great start. The Army's major exercise program, based on simulations, has never gone away. And I think that there will be a bubble in the officer corps in terms of officers who never got to maneuver platoons or companies when they were company-grade officers. But as they mature in the ranks and as they grow in the Army, I think that they will be exposed to that and they'll have the opportunity to hone those skills.